Hi, this is Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Interarbor Solutions, and you're listening to Briefings Direct. Complexity and security challenges can hobble the growth of financial transactions and private data-laden consumer-facing SaaS applications. Add to that the need to bring user experiences that are simple, intuitive, and personalized, and you have a thorny thicket of software development challenges. Stay with us now as we explore how streamlined and cost-efficient home-brokerage-enabler Houwzer constructed a resilient API-based platform to form the heart of its services integration engine used for buying and selling real estate. To learn how Houwzer makes the most of APIs and protects its user data while preventing vulnerabilities, please join me now in welcoming our guest. We're here with Greg Phillips, the Chief Technology Officer at Houwzer. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Dana. It's nice to be here.
We're really glad to have you with us. Greg, explain what Houwzer does and then why you chose the API-intensive architecture that you did for your core platform.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we are a real estate brokerage. We're also a mortgage brokerage and a title agency. And the secret sauce is our technology platform that binds those things together and creates a seamless end-to-end experience for our consumers, whether they're buying a home or selling a home, that they can have those services that are typically fragmented, different companies, kind of chaotic transaction. We're streamlining all of that into a much smoother experience with salaried agents, a consistent technology platform across the whole transaction, and really rethinking how real estate transactions are done and really trying to make it a better experience across the board, inclusive of all of those services. And one of the things that we decided early on was that we needed to build essentially a protocol for conducting real estate transactions. There's laws and regulations for how to do it in different jurisdictions. And instead of having to have this unmanageable thing where in one area they're doing it one way, another area they're doing another way, we obviously have to comply with all the local rules and regulations for doing real estate transactions or for doing mortgages or for title. But there are common elements. So what we've kind of built into our system are these common elements around the real estate transaction. And then from there, we can localize within the local jurisdiction that we're in to provide the service, but still have a consistent experience across the country in terms of offering our services. And so that's one of the reasons that we started, I think, API first in some ways, was that we really wanted to think about the protocol and the building blocks of the platform that we were offering to our agents and coordinators and mortgage advisors to offer their services. And then we layered on the front end, which has a lot more of the localization and other parts. So we really kind of very intentionally thought about it as a protocol for conducting real estate transactions rather than just jumping in, building like an app to manage a specific type of real estate transaction in a specific jurisdiction.
And so when you say API first, what do you mean? Was that how you went about constructing your internal platform? Was it also perhaps for the integration points, all of the above? What do you mean by API first?
Yeah, all of the above. I think that we wanted to build an API that was flexible enough to support lots of variants within a specific type of real estate transaction. So right now, we're already in 7 states. I still think we're pretty early in our journey. We're going to be adding more states and more jurisdictions. And we knew from the get-go that was the direction that we were going to go. So we put a lot of thought into our data model and into our API such that we wouldn't have to kind of rewrite or break the API every time we entered a new jurisdiction. We wanted to have a flexible underlying API that we could then use to offer a finished product that might look a bit different in Maryland than it does in Pennsylvania, for example.
So it's pretty evident that there's the flexibility, the speed of development, being able to reuse things that exist that are libraries of services, if you will. Those are some of the good things about APIs. But What are some of the downsides? What happens perhaps and can detract from that versatility when you just start cobbling together rather APIs?
One of the downsides of APIs is once you put it out there into the world, you are supporting that API for better or worse. And so things get built against it. And if you then want to change or rethink what you want to do with that API, you then have these downstream dependencies that are reliant on that API. So it's not like you're in a single code base where if you want to refactor, you can use your IDE to go see all the things that this might break if you were to change this. The API, it's a little harder to get your arms around exactly who's out there using it, what might break if you change the API. So you have kind of this, I think, semi-permanence to an API that is somewhat unique, I think, in the software development realm. Things move with a lot of flux. We have libraries that are updating all the time, especially you see in the JavaScript ecosystem, things are going a mile a minute. When you have an API, I think you have to be a little bit more thoughtful about what you put out there ahead of time, because it is harder to change, harder to version, harder to migrate. It's just kind of by definition something that you've chosen to set in stone, at least for some period of time, so that people can build against it. And our API we do interact with third parties. I think the vast majority of the usage of our API is for our internal front-end application that uses the API. So it's not like we have tons of different stakeholders on the API, but it is still something we think about a lot. And then obviously security is another huge undertaking when you put an API out there. This is not an API that is just sitting behind a firewall or something. This is an API that is on the internet for conducting real estate transactions, which are a highly sensitive transaction. So obviously security is a huge concern as well when building an API.
And of course, there's so many different parties and players and services involved with a real estate transaction. And in order to get people to rely on you as sort of a hub for that activity, there needs to be an element of trust. And there also has to be trust of one that's going to perform, but trust that, as you point out, it's going to be safe and that privacy is going to be assured. What did you need to do to bring that level of resiliency to your API? How did you troubleshoot your own API in order to make sure that others would view it favorably?
We've always, from the beginning, been really concerned with security. So even before we had any transactions running through the system and we were just in the design phases of the API, we knew that what we were doing was an industry where we're really constantly under attack. So the most common and most dangerous thing that happens in the real estate brokerage industry is where some non-public information about a transaction is somehow leaked. And then there's a lot of criminals out there that can use that information to attempt to exploit our customers. So an example of that would be if they find out information about when a closing is supposed to be in the name of the title company, they could pose as an agent of that title company and say, hey, for your upcoming closing, the wiring instructions have changed. You actually need to wire here instead of there. And we've seen brokerages across the country fall victim to that pretty consistently over the past at least 5 to 10 years, if not longer. But it's been a huge problem in the industry. And it's one of the things where having all of our transaction data flowing through an API, it enables this great user experience of having a very streamlined transaction. But at the same time, we need to make sure that that information is staying private to our clients and to our agents and to our coordinators and not leaking any data to the public through the API. So that's been paramount for us. And as far as performance, I think we've been pretty fortunate that our business we do relatively fewer higher value transactions. So we haven't had to achieve super scale with our APIs. So I would say that like our security concerns are at like a 10, but our scalability concerns, fortunately, we don't have to worry about as much. Maybe it's like a 2 because it's just not open to the masses. You have to decide to work with us to actually get into our system and work with us through on a transaction. So it's just a relatively smaller audience and it's more of a premium service than like a free service out there on the internet where like the whole world's hitting your API.
Okay, well, given that there's such a need for that level of security and you are public-facing API, you can't use the perimeter level of security. You need to look at different ways of anticipating vulnerabilities and heading them off. So when you can't use the fortress approach to security, what's the next best approach?
Yeah, I think you have to be really aware of what it is you're putting out into the world. So you have to assume the worst, I suppose, about who is going to be interacting with your API and really make sure that there is no way for an unauthorized person to gain access to information that they're not privy to. So this was one of the things that since the beginning of building this platform that kept me up at night. And one of the things that ultimately led me to Traceable was, I wanted to effectively get more confidence around how my APIs were being used out in the world. So you try to think about as much as you can when you're building it. You reason through, okay, this is who's going to be calling this. We don't want to expose any additional information here. We want to have just the information that we needed, no additional information that might leak out. Really strong access controls on each API request, what parameters will accept, what things will update, what will show in each scenario based on all the different user rules. And obviously that's a lot to keep track of. And you always worry that, is there some misalignment or misconfiguration that we're missing somewhere? And being able to monitor that, where you look at how the API is getting used and actually in some sense have essentially an AI looking for that type of thing, in addition to the ability to query for it, I think has been really attractive to us. It's given us a lot of confidence around that in practice, we are not leaking the data that we think and we strive to not leak. And it's an additional level of validation on top of that. So instead of enforcing a perimeter and not letting anybody in, we're really careful about what we put out there beyond the perimeter. And not only are we careful about what we put out there beyond the perimeter, we're also monitoring it very closely, which I think is key.
Right. And that monitoring gives you the opportunity to create a baseline of behaviors, and even for unintended consequences of how people use your API, at least you have a record of that. And you're doing it at a scale because there's a lot of data involved that humans couldn't quite keep up with it, but you've got your machine learning and AI technologies to bring to bear on that. What have you learned by that level of being able to observe and trace things to that degree?
Yeah, so I think the obvious is that we have discovered a few vulnerabilities that we weren't aware of. So areas where we were exposing or potentially exposing more information than we meant to in a given API endpoint. So that was identified and fixed. I think we've also kind of seen some areas where people try to attack. So even though we don't have the vulnerability, we've seen malicious actors hitting our API, attempting to do a SQL injection, attempting to read a file on the file system, attempting to run a command on the system. You actually see that stuff and see how they're doing it without having to kind of parse through raw API requests, which aren't human readable. So those are a couple of the things that I think are the first order things. I think second order things that we've seen that are really interesting is looking at the API requests segmented by our users and our user roles. So what API requests do our clients tend to hit? What API requests do our agents tend to make? What API requests do our coordinators tend to make? And kind of looking at how are these different stakeholders interacting with the API has been really interesting to see, as far as like a planning perspective and just outside of security. Just it's been fascinating to see how the system gets used, the kind of natural rhythms, like when is it used during the day? When are these types of things happening versus these other types of things happening? It's really interesting to see that, which would be very hard to see in the non-human readable raw API requests when you kind of aggregate it and display it in an aggregated information display. You can actually start to see some of that stuff. And the API is a living, breathing thing that you can kind of look at and observe as it's out there in the world.
Not only is it breathing and living, but it's easily updated. So how do you create a feedback from what you learned in your observability phase and then bring that into the development iteration process? Is there a tight bond between them? And who feels that? As a CTO, are you the one that has to cross the chasm between what you observe in operations and then what you can ameliorate in development?
Yeah, generally, yes. I think that I view that as key part of my role. I think, our software engineers are in there looking at it as well, but I hold myself accountable for that function. And I try to recruit, I think, very generalist software engineers that can take into account security, they can take into account product, they can take into account to a certain extent, like user experience when they're building things, so that I find it very hard to build a cohesive and secure product if you're just kind of throwing requirements over the fence from different departments to the software engineers and saying, build this. I think you lose something. I think that there has to be a complete understanding in one accountable individual's mind to really deliver a complete product. And that's not to say those areas of the company shouldn't have input on what gets built, but the engineers in my mind have to have some understanding. So I like to give them as much data as possible to understand what they're putting out there so that they have that in their mind when they're actually writing the code.
And have your developers been open and, I guess, receptive to this information? Or do they say, well, that's the security person's job, not mine? Or how well can your developers actually use this observability of API behavior data?
Yeah, I think that we all on the team feel a responsibility for the security of our system. I think everyone takes that really seriously. I don't think anyone thinks that it's someone else's problem. And we all kind of know that we all have to watch out for it. That being said, not everyone is a security expert. So some people may know more or less than others about information security. None of us are dedicated information security professionals. So we kind of rely on the actual input from the Traceable platform and from some of the things that we're seeing happen to actually learn about, like, what are the things that we should be worrying about? What are the things that we thought about things A, B, and C, but what about D, E, and F that we don't even know about yet? Let's look at this. And I think it's, really about also having a culture of learning as well as having generalists, like people that are wanting to get better, innately wanting to build a secure system and wanting to learn about how to convey a secure API. I think that is increasingly part of the job description for software engineers to take that into account. I think, especially as we start to see, I think some of these higher value services like our own being offered directly on the internet. So you think about years ago, real estate transactions and financial transactions and a lot of these things were like they'd have some front end, but then some person would go put it into a mainframe like that night. And then they actually do the financial transaction after like humans looked at it. And then like the next morning after it ran on the mainframe, like they look at it again and then they like update your bank account. Like there's a lot of layers of review in there. Whereas I think now there's more automation. Things are starting to happen live via APIs on the internet. And I think that's created much more of a reason for developers to really truly understand the security implications of what they're building, because you can't insert a failsafe as easily as you start to remove friction. So if you have a lot of friction points, you can have review points and checkpoints and a really locked down process. But as you eliminate friction, which is what consumers want, there's less natural insertion points for like a true dedicated security or dedicated, fraud prevention individual to review something. You have to actually do it live in an automated way. It has to be built into the thing itself.
And of course, these transactions come with, a high amount of urgency for people. This is their home. This is one of the biggest transactions of their lives, often in hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, they're not going to be interested in a wishy-washy API. Yeah. So when it comes to being the creator of an API that satisfies such high requirements, you must have a pretty good idea of what a good service is. How did Traceable do in terms of how its usability is? How well were you able to consume that as a service, bring it into your organization? Is there a sort of user-friendly approach to the Traceable services that you enjoyed?
Yeah, definitely. I think what I like about the Traceable user experience is that you can engage with it at multiple levels. So on the sort of most naive level, you log in and it's pushing out immediate threats right to you can go in and see like, this is what happened since you last logged in, and you can kind of review your threat inbox. It's really surfacing the most important things to look at right away, which is great. Then I think in addition to that, and that is the most important thing, but then you also have questions about how are these APIs being used? What else should we be thinking about? And I think they give you really great tools to drill down as well. So you can kind of navigate to some of the different ways of aggregating all of the API usage data and visualizing as well to look at, I mentioned usage patterns before. You can plot, how is this API being used? You can look at performance as well as security. So even if you're feeling good about the security, you can kind of start to notice, this API is getting called a lot. Latency doesn't look great. Maybe we should take a look at that. So there's a lot of things in there where you can go really deep. I don't think I've gotten to the bottom. I think there's more to discover in there. There's tons of ways, I think, to slice and dice and look at things, which is awesome because I tend to be a power user and like to figure things out. But at the same time, I think they do a great job of using their intelligence to surface the most important things and the most critical security-wise things and getting those in front of you in the first place.
Right. So when you have a great deal of data and a history that goes with it, and you have the observability and behavior analysis to point out vulnerabilities, you've also got a very rich data set to do other analytics on.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like it's providing you a ramp, an on-ramp to a more analytics-driven approach to not only requirements and development, but even process around development.
Yeah, and I would even extend that into even process around our operations in terms of our real estate operations. I think we're offering a product through our technology that is ultimately an offline product, which is a real estate transaction. And we can actually see the API things that we need to do to make the real world thing happen. So I would say we have a lot of stakeholders. We have three really critical stakeholders I've mentioned before. It's the client, the real estate agent, and the coordinator, who is the transaction coordinator that's making sure everything goes smoothly. And we can kind of see if the coordinator is trying to do something or the user is trying to do something and they're getting errors. We can kind of see this is a point in the real estate transaction where we might not have everything buttoned up. We got errors happening on this API because the information that we expected to be there is incomplete. And so it's not able to get to this next step of the transaction. So you can actually uncover things that are not explicitly in the technology. It's like there's a process problem here. Like we actually need to get this information ahead of this point and we don't always have it. So how do we build that into our protocol for the future?
Right. Super important when you can take advantage of analytics, but then re-engineer the process as an analytics-rich environment.
Yeah.
Okay. Any suggestions for other folks that are grappling with API economy, as some people call it, that have an opportunity to leverage APIs, but are concerned that they want to make sure that the end users are able to benefit, but that the bad guys are not able to exploit? Any sort of words of wisdom now that you've been through this API journey for others that are starting to rely on them more and more?
Yeah, start small and expand. Don't try to put the kitchen sink out there all at once. So we now represent people selling their home, people buying a home, people getting a mortgage, people who need title insurance, and people doing all of those things together all at once. However, our first transactions through our system were just people listing their home. So we said, let's take kind of this specific process. And even at the time that we launched, it was a much less detailed version of the process than what we have today. And let's support this. So I think it's really important to release something early that is complete, but limited in scope. I think the scope creep of trying to pack in a lot at once is what causes security issues, is what causes performance issues. It causes usability issues. I think start simple and expand is probably the best piece of advice I have.
Okay, well, assuming that you are going to continue to crawl, walk, and then eventually run, what comes next for Houwzer? For those who are interested in using your application, what does the future portend, and what other transactions might this protocol approach lend itself to?
We've thought about what are the things that you need in order to consummate a real estate transaction. So we've covered 3 of those. We are missing one, which is homeowners insurance. So we consider the potential core services that we could offer. And by core, we mean essential to purchasing a home, which is brokerage, mortgage, title, and homeowners insurance. So that is a piece that is in the works for us. And then outside of the core piece, there's lots of things that people need when they're buying and selling homes, whether that's resources to fix up their current home, resources to move, guidance around where in the country should I move now that I'm a remote worker. There's lots of different things I think to think about building out from the core. So we've started at the core. We wanted to start in the transaction and build our way out. That was a very intentional strategy. When you look at a Zillow or a Redfin or some of the other real estate technology companies, they've started with the portal and then tried to bolt on the real estate services behind the portal. We're trying to build the best version, technology-enabled real estate services, and then build from that core outward into more of those niceties. So I think some of the next things on our product roadmap are, I think, pre-transaction, helping our consumers make more educated decisions about the transactions they're going to enter into. And then, by the way, we have this bulletproof, secure, battle-tested system for doing it, and great real estate agents that will help guide you through the process.
Well, really great. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. You've been listening to a sponsored Briefings Direct discussion on how a streamlined and cost-efficient home brokerage enabler, Houwzer, constructed a resilient API-based platform. And you've learned how protecting user data and preventing vulnerabilities across an end-to-end services protocol approach has allowed Houwzer to deliver user experiences that are simple, intuitive, personalized, and trusted. So a big thank you to our guest. We've been here with Greg Phillips, Chief Technology Officer at Houwzer. Thanks so much, Greg.
Yeah, thank you as well. It's been a pleasure.
And a big thank you to our audience for joining us for this Briefings Direct API resiliency discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host throughout this series of Traceable AI-sponsored Briefings Direct interviews. Hey, thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your community and do come back next time.